The age-old debate of adding water to whiskey. Whiskey drinkers seem to constantly argue about whether you should or should not add water to whiskey. But does adding water to your whiskey actually improve your whiskey experience? We're going to find out on today's whiskey experiment. What's up, whiskey nerds? Welcome back to the Whiskey Experiment, the channel all about bringing science and whiskey together to help improve your whiskey experience. My name is Jake. This is a bottle of Dalmore 15 Single Malt Scotch whiskey, and this is a jug of water, obviously. Today's experiment is aimed at the concept of adding water to your whiskey. Of course, this topic is a polarizing one within the whiskey community with a huge variance on opinions. But we aren't here to talk about opinions. We're here to talk about facts and science.
Science!
So let's get into it. After doing a little research on the internet, we come across a few interesting recommendations on how much water you should add to your whiskey. In 2017, researchers Bjorn Carlson and Rand Friedman published a scientific study where they used a computer simulation to demonstrate what happened to whiskey when it dilutes in a glass. Though this computation was limited in the specific molecules they were analyzing, they found that if you dilute a whiskey to 27% alcohol by volume, you brought some of those components out of solution to the surface of the whiskey where they would be more easily accessible to your nose and your mouth when you smell and drink it. Within the Scotch whiskey world, this is actually in agreement with the overall consensus. Many whiskey experts like Richard Patterson, the master blender of White & Mackay, the makers of this Dalmore, suggest diluting your whiskey down from the 40% that this whiskey is bottled at, down to 35% to help bring out those flavors and make them more easily identifiable. Whiskey blenders in Scotland as a whole take this even further by diluting their whiskey down to 20% alcohol by volume to help in the blending process. And then of course you have your whiskey snobs who say, you should never, and I say never, ever put any water into your whiskey. How dare you defile this great spirit? It's amazing by itself, and how darn dare you? Well, who's right here? Good news, I have the answer. Well, at least I will have the answer by the end of this experiment, hopefully, with science.
Science!
But first, we're gonna need some more supplies. In order to really get to the bottom of this, we need to perform not just one, but 3 experiments. And here's why. With so many variables involved, we have to perform multiple experiments to eliminate as many variables as we can. And let me be clear, these experiments are not about finding which combination of whiskey and water tastes better, as that is just based off of opinion. Instead, we want to figure out which choices are most impactful and then use that data to help form our opinion later. The first thing we need to do is figure out how water affects different styles of whiskey. And to do that, we of course need to select a few different whiskeys. And while we are choosing different styles, at the beginning we're going to try to stay at about the same proof point and at a higher proof point. We're going to test out the impact of proof later, but at the beginning we're going to go with higher proof because that'll allow us to understand how the water we add to whiskey affects it rather than the water that the distiller adds to it before it goes into a bottle. Now, first up, we're gonna need a whiskey that is the same type of whiskey that research article investigated, which is a peated single malt Scotch. For that category, we're gonna use Ardbeg Uigeadail. It's a great high proof representation of that category. Of course, many of us are bourbon drinkers, so we're gonna have to get something for that. We're gonna grab the Old Forester 1920 for that category. And then finally, we're gonna need a rye to mix it up just a little bit. For that, we're gonna go with a classic Pikesville Rye. So now that we have our whiskey, let's get this experiment started. All right, so here is how we're gonna do things. I've poured 2 glasses of each whiskey. One row is gonna be the control, where we are not gonna add any water to. And then the second row, we are gonna add water to it bit by bit and compare that to the first row. I'm gonna do this one by one between each whiskey, starting on your left with the bourbon. Now, as I mentioned, this is Old Forester 1920 Prohibition style, which is a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey that is 115 proof or 57.5% alcohol by volume. You get the classic bourbon notes, something really quintessential about Old Forester and this product in general is you really get those brown sugars, you get that deep, rich caramel, along with the oak, the spice, and everything that makes this good. Let's go to the palate. Right off the bat, that proof punches you in the mouth in the best way possible. 115 proof, and you really feel it. You start getting that warm tingle, but as that goes away, those caramels and those brown sugars and the cherry notes, they really come out and envelop your mouth in a lot of flavor. It coats your whole mouth and it's very viscous. It's got that viscosity, and that's something that I want to keep an eye on as we start diluting the whiskey. Yeah, this is much more aromatic now. And now you get more sweetness on the front, but harshness on the back. It's got that harsh note that alcohol and the tannins really come out. Very interesting. The flavors aren't that different though. And that's important because that's one of the things we're looking for here, to see how much the whiskey changes from this to this. And it changes some, but not a whole lot. All right, moving on to the Pikesville. Again, these are the same. This is Pikesville, a Kentucky straight rye whiskey, which is 6 years old and 110 proof or 55% alcohol by volume. Now on the nose, you really get that difference between going from a bourbon to a rye. It does sting your nostrils just a bit.
Stings the nostrils.
But it's certainly not as hot as the 115 proof 1920. Let's go on the palate. Wow. The sweetness really comes through at the beginning, but that rye spice just comes through at the end. Similar to the Old Forester, it really coats your mouth. It coats all the way around your tongue, and you really feel it from all directions. That viscosity is something that, though it might not be quite as viscous feeling as the 1920, it certainly envelops your mouth, and it really, you can keep tasting it over and over, even after you've swallowed it. This actually comes across muted. I thought before the flavors jumped out a little bit more in the 1920 after adding some water, but on the Pikesville, it's very subdued. Oh, wow. Wow, no harshness at all. Just a little bit of water is all this needed to, it's all sweetness. A little bit of spice, but not in any harsh way, the way that the spice came across in the 1920. Yeah, the nose is really just starting to go away now. So it definitely changes. That first little bit of water really, I think, improved it and actually cut off all of the sharp edges, rounded it out, and now it's quite nice. But as you keep adding water, it just gets kind of dull and boring. All right, that said, let's move on to the Ardbeg. All right, Ardbeg. Woo! Going from bourbon and rye to a peated single malt Scotch is just like hitting a wall in a car. No, like hitting a wall on a motorcycle going 60. Oh man. Smoke, peat, it jumps out of the glass. A little bit of the brininess, a little bit of a phenolic kind of note, kind of plasticky, just a tiny bit. But let's go on the palate. It's still very sweet on the palate, but the smoke really comes through, but sort of envelops everything. It's got a very nice malty flavor to it, and that's something I really like about this Ardbeg, which I didn't mention before is a single malt Scotch whiskey from the Isle of Islay, and it comes through at a very specific 54.2% alcohol by volume. So in the realm of these, some more similar and proof to this, but really on the taste, you don't get that at all. I mean, you could tell me this is 90 proof and I would believe you. It is very drinkable, even though it's got those strong flavors, and it's very interesting. Now let's add some water to this glass and see what happens. I get a lot more sweetness now. It was sweeter on the palate before, but in this glass you can really get that smoke, where here the smoke has died away a little bit. It's kind of in the background. Yes, much sweeter, and almost the smoke comes through, but it's almost an ashy smoke now. It's gotten much more different. I'm gonna add a little bit more water, as I've done with the others, and we'll see where it takes us. Much like the Pikesville, any bitterness or harshness just has gone away. It is all gone. But one thing that I will make a distinction is each of these first two, when you added water, things start dying down. With the Pikesville, it happened a little bit quicker than the 1920, but both of them, the flavors kind of went away as you got more and more water. With this, they aren't going away. They're just changing a little bit. They're becoming a little bit more sweet, or, you know, the smoke isn't quite as present, but it's still there. Okay, after going through each of these one by one, I think we have a clear standout here, and that's the Ardbeg Uigeadail. The addition of water didn't just change the whiskey, it transformed it into something that I thought was more palatable. You can get more out of it. And that's sort of what people talk about when you talk about adding water to whiskey. With that said, let's take this bottle of Ardbeg to our next round where we test out proof. To understand how proof is affected by water, we're gonna do a very simple test here. We're gonna take a look at the category that our previous experiment revealed was the most impacted by water, and that's single malt Scotch whiskey. And we're gonna use two representatives of proof. We've got a high proof option here, which is the Ardbeg Uigeadail, the same whiskey we just used. And for a low proof whiskey in the same category, we have Lagavulin 16. These are both from the Scottish island of Islay, and both have a peated malt character to them. The big difference being that Lagavulin is, of course, a different distillery, and key to this experiment is that it is bottled at 86 proof or 43% alcohol, as opposed to the over 104 proof Ardbeg. We're gonna go through this the same way we just did with the different types of whiskey. Since we already know how Ardbeg is affected by water, let's just find out how Lagavulin is affected and if it's more or less impacted by the addition of water. Again, you get that peat character, although it's a little bit different of a peat. It's more of an ashy type peat and less sweet, although both of these do have a sherry cask influence, which certainly comes through. It's very easy drinking, but one thing that does stand out is, again, that peat character of ash. But now let's see how this is affected by some water. Now, I don't want to add a ton of water to this because we really need to take it slow with it being a lot lower in proof, but it's definitely having an impact. Let's see how it smells. So I made a funny face. It's kind of interesting because the first thing I smelled was ethanol, which was more so than on the unaltered version. Now it's dying down and it's more, the sherry influence actually comes through a little bit stronger. More of those plums and prunes and grape juice. Let's check the palate. Very sweet. The peat dies away a lot, especially compared to this. This tastes like it has ash in it, and this is just sweet. Let's add a little bit more water and then we'll make a judgment here. Yeah, it just kind of dies away now. It's diluted to the point where it's just sweet and really kind of uninteresting. You don't get the 16-year-old at all. The age is lost, the complexity is lost. And as I mentioned with the bourbon and the rye, this is very similar, that it changes, but I won't say it evolves at all. It doesn't change in complexity. It gets lower in complexity actually, and it's easier to drink because the ashy peat is not as off-putting, but it's also just not quite as enjoyable to me personally. And it's really not all that different other than just flavors going away. So with that said, I still think this Ardbeg Uigeadail cask strength peated Scotch is really the best representative so far of water affecting whiskey. Now that may not be that big of a surprise to anybody, but really the difference between the high proof and the low proof was pretty significant. Well, now that we have our whiskey selected, I think we're ready for our final experiment. And that's how much water should you add to your whiskey? Let me get some clean glasses out here and we'll test it out. All right, with our control now selected, we can now test the impact of various amounts of water on your whiskey experience. If you recall from the beginning of the episode, we talked about different levels of dilution and how they may or may not be recommended based on who you ask. So to test each, we are going to have a glass that represents each of those dilution levels. In the first glass is going to be whiskey straight out of the bottle, no water added. The next glass, we're going to add just a few drops of water, basically the same that we did in the previous two tests. The third glass is going to have whiskey diluted down to 35% ABV, as suggested by Richard Patterson. The fourth glass is going to be 27% ABV, as referenced in the Scientific Journal article. And finally, we're gonna have the 20% ABV glass, which is the standard amongst whiskey blenders and likely the way the whiskey was tasted before it went in this bottle. Now I'm gonna pour these glasses, get the dilution right, and we're gonna test this out once and for all. All right, we got our glasses poured. I did a little math back here to show how much water we actually need to add to each of these glasses to make the dilution the way that we're looking at. Let's get into it. Whew. It really jumps out of the glass, and certainly the ethanol jumps out. After doing a few dilution experiments so far, that's something that really stands out by this. We're gonna go through and nose these before we get into the palate. And that one is certainly the same as the baseline. You still get a lot of ethanol in this one. I'd almost even say more ethanol. And that's very interesting, but still some of that peat, some of the aroma, but certainly less peat. Let's see if that continues. Third glass is all sherry. There's also a bit of a weird note in this. It's hard to describe, but it's not the most pleasant smell, but it's something completely different. Something I did not smell in these. It's almost like a wet sponge almost. It's that kind of, maybe it's a little bit of the brine, but very different from the first two. Let's keep moving on to number 4. It has more of that note from the last time, but it turns more of a chemical type of note to it. The phenolic type of experience. You do still keep the same aspects of the Ardbeg as the previous glasses. It doesn't necessarily diminish, it changes. All right, that's enough of that one. Very strange. And this one, this is more than half water. This is almost completely water at this point. But wow, that chemical note comes through really strong. Now this is 20% ABV. It's not even technically whiskey anymore, but man, it still comes through. That's pretty amazing. All right, now I'm gonna go through and taste them, and I'm actually gonna taste them backwards this time, starting with the lower proof and moving up. Not a ton going on, but you do pick up different things one by one. Whereas when you taste the Ardbeg just out of the bottle, it all kind of comes at you at the same time. Everything is just sort of, it's almost like you get jumped by the whiskey. Every flavor, every component, every smell, it's overwhelming. But the interesting thing about this, and I can see why whiskey blenders do this, is because you can really pick it apart. I can taste the smoke component of the peat separate from the brininess and that aspect of it. You can pick up the bourbon influences from the cask, which is super interesting, and I haven't tasted that on any of the other ones so far. That's fascinating. Let's move up in proof, now up to 27%. So certainly less sweetness, a little bit more bite to it, which makes sense. But the malty aspect to it comes through, which is also interesting because if you remember on the previous experiment, the malt character of the whiskey came through on both the unaltered and altered whiskey, but here you get the malt without the sweetness from the malt. Yeah, very different. I don't get that chemically taste as much as on the nose with that one, but certainly getting more of the character and more vanilla on this actually, which that's the kind of bourbon note that I was explaining before. Okay, now on to the 35%. Yep. You can taste the alcohol, but it's not overwhelming at all. It is very manageable. It doesn't burn. There's a very faint, I'll call it a tingle. You can certainly feel that there's alcohol in it, where these two, you can almost not feel it at all. But it's not affecting you in any way. It's just sort of one more flavor component. Very interesting. On to the few drops, which is about 45%. Oh wow. It got harsh. The sweetness is not nearly as prominent. It comes through a little bit on the finish, but it's got a lot more tannic quality to it. That's very interesting. Finally, we've made it to the cask strength or bottle strength. Yeah, that just punches you. Fantastic. What's interesting is going from the 20% all the way up to the 54% ABV, you're still tasting the same whiskey, but it's like an evolution. You can see all the flavor components one by one, and then as you move up, you taste them all at the same time and it can be overwhelming. And I think that is really the lesson to be learned here. Fascinating results here. I think we have a very clear understanding of what's going on here, but let's talk a little bit about what it means in terms of your whiskey experience. I think that really showed us what it is about this particular whiskey that has the opportunity to change with water. I also think diluting down to the various different levels, but especially even all the way down to 20% ABV, really brought out some of the components of the whiskey that you weren't tasting at cask strength. But with all of that in mind, the question still remains, would I add water to my whiskey? Well, yeah, absolutely I would add water to my whiskey. I mean, drinking it neat versus diluted completely changed the whiskey experience. You are drinking completely different whiskeys. You're able to identify so many different components. And sure, the whiskey drink itself, it doesn't coat the mouth as much. It's probably not quite as enjoyable personally, but the experience of adding all of that water to this whiskey and seeing how it changed was just amazing. And for that reason alone, adding water to your whiskey should not be something that's frowned upon. It should be something that is celebrated, and something I think everybody should experiment with on their own. Now, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this experiment. If you did, please hit that like button. If you're new to this channel and want to see more, please subscribe. And if you have any thoughts or experiments, things that you would like to see done on this show, please let me know in the comments below, and maybe we'll make it into a future episode. I would also like to give a shout out to all the people that commented on my previous video, my first video. I really appreciate all the feedback. I hope you can see in this video that I took your comments to heart, and I'm hopefully improving each time to give you a better product with each new video. Now, if you haven't seen that previous video, it is linked right up here. Please go check it out. If you want to see what's happening with the channel, behind the scenes, upcoming bottles that we're using on the show, check us out on Instagram at The Whiskey Experiment, link down below. Thank you all so much. My name is Jake. This has been The Whiskey Experiment. And as I will always say, never stop experimenting. We'll see you next time.